touched on in the beginning of our discussion, you have an incredible history going back to the heydays of Universal Recording. That's the actual name, right? Universal Recording?
Yep.
Now, that was originally founded by Bill Putnam, right?
Yes, indeed. Bill Putnam, you would have to say, is the grandfather of the modern recording studio. There's no question about it.
Yuri.
Yep. Founded Universal and then went to California, founded United Audio, and which ultimately became Yuri. So Bill Putnam in 1946 built the first Universal recording studio. It was actually in Evanston. And he got a job doing transcription. So in those days, somebody like Bing Crosby would do his radio play once for the East Coast and then would have to do the whole thing again for the West Coast. So what they would do is they would actually record it on disc, and they would make copies of these, and they would send them out so he didn't have to do his show twice. Bing Crosby was very much into this new technology because he didn't want to do the show twice.
Yeah, didn't he own Ampex or something?
He had some of the earliest tape machines, yeah.
Yeah.
So Bill Putnam, their first big gig was doing transcription disc. He said he did 7,000 shows over the years. So they started out in Evanston, and Bill, I love this quote. He said, "In addition to managing the business and financing, my goals were to concentrate on two prime areas, the development of new recording techniques and the development of new technical equipment, which was more specialized. Before that, most of the equipment was broadcast equipment. It was not designed for recording." So they started out with a lathe, and they were recording the lathe. A year later, he went and packed it up, and he moved into the 42nd floor of the Civic Opera House, the Chicago Civic Opera House, and started a studio up there.
What floor was it?
42nd floor. 42nd floor of the Chicago Civic Opera House.
Wow, that's a big building.
Yes, indeed. It was shortly after he moved there, he did a tune with the Harmonicats. The Harmonicats. It blew up. It was an overnight smash. It sold 1.4 million copies. And Bill said, "I was there in 1947 that I recorded Peg on My Heart with the Harmonicats. Peg on My Heart was released on our own Universal recording label. It was reported to be the first pop record to use artificial reverberation." So he set a speaker in the men's room, put a microphone down there, and built a console that had echo send so that you could actually send audio in there. Said went down there one day and it was pouring down rain and it had actually flooded in there and his speaker was floating. So he decided at that point that this was not, he wanted his own facility. He wanted his own facility built the way he wanted. So they moved to 46 East Walton, and he built this state-of-the-art facility. It had 3 rooms, Studio A, Studio B, and Studio C. Studio A was the biggest room. Bruce Swedeen, who started in 1957 working for him, he hired him to work in the B room, and Bruce said about this room, he said, "This was a magnificent room. The dimensions of the A room were 80 feet by 60 feet with 30-foot ceilings, floated floors, suspended walls, variable acoustics. One of the best-sounding rooms in the world." And this is Bruce Swedeen saying this. It was a magnificent room. We had 75 musicians in there for Ramsey Lewis record. I mean, it was a gorgeous room. It was huge. I'll flash a picture up here. Notice on the picture there's an actual drum booth that wheeled around, so you could set up this drum booth virtually anywhere in the room.
I forget what they called it, like the drum hutch or something.
Drum hotel was sometimes what we used. Yeah. Bill built the first modern console. Rotary faders, 12 inputs, preamps, and dedicated echo sends. I'll show you a picture of it here. Bill Putnam was the father of modern recording as we know it. This is Bruce Swedeen. The processes and designs that we take for granted, the design of modern recording desks, the way components are laid out and the way they function, with Q sends, echo sends, multi-track switching, they all originated in Bill's imagination. Bill was building these consoles in his own tech shop. This ultimately became the Universal Audio 610. I mean, that was the father of the modern console. So when I started at Universal, there were 3 studios, big Studio A, and in 78, they already had the Neve 8048, the classic console. I mean, this was the greatest console ever made. It's still functioning. It's at Village Recorders in L.A., and it's still out there. About a year after I got there, we added NECAM automation, Neve computer-assisted automation, and it was the first non-VCA automation, and every fader had a little motor under it and a piece of fishing wire that would move the fader up and down. It was a brilliant system. 1980, they brought in the first 32-track digital machine, the 3M machine, and then in 82, they brought in the Mitsubishi and the Atari. Studio B, when I got there, was a MCI 400 series console. Reasonable console, not fabulous. 1984, Murray put in the first SSL in Chicago. And the SSL at that time was mind-boggling. It was the first console with active switching. You know, you actually had, instead of pushing down all the line amps and all the mix amps and stuff, you actually had a button. You switched it from mix mode to tracking mode. It was incredible. All the functionality of the console, the tape machine was all done at the console. Plus, for the first time, you had automation and recall. You could actually recall. Recall in the old Neve was me sitting there at 3 a.m. after the session with a huge piece of paper, writing down where every equalizer and every bus was assigned.
Not an exact science.
No. Studio C was a small room. It had an 8-track Ampex machine in it. And then shortly after, this would be in the 1980s, about the time they got the Synclavier, they built a new room which was designed to be the Synclavier room. And it had a Harrison console in it that was really not particularly great. And then a few years after that, they built a room that was designed for video lockup and stuff. It had a 1-inch C machine. And they put a MCI 600 series. It was called the back room. That was the room with the piano that was locked in that you couldn't move.
Right.
In addition to those, there were 3 production studios, F, K, and the Penthouse, which were designed for voiceovers and stuff like that. And then there was an entire film side. There were 2 huge film mixing theaters, and then they had a dubbing room, a stereo edit room, and a mono edit room. So it was a huge facility. I mean, this was a major thing.
Wow, what an incredible facility. Now, for those who might have ever been in LA at some studios, Ocean Way and United Recording reminded me very much of what that Studio A, the big room at Universal, looks like. And I imagine so many of the great engineers that started there, Bruce Sweeting included, kind of took all that with them to LA, and like so much of the techniques and like gear, the building the boxes for the outboard gear, the way to design a live end, dead end control room. You know, the live room at Ocean Way looks very, very similar. It has the variable acoustics, right, which were like panels that you could pull off the wall or something like that.
They were curved panels, so you could put the dead side out and it would quiet the room down a little bit, or you could put the live side out and make it a little bit, you know, splashier.
Yeah, control the decay time. I had an opportunity to work at Skywalker Sound in San Francisco, Marin County, and they had a version of that where you could go out into this huge gymnasium-sized live room, the scoring stage, and you could push a button, and the louvers would bring baffles out, and you could tune the decay time of the room from like 1 second to like 4 seconds. Unbelievable, you know, it's incredible. So, okay, you got Bill Putnam, who's like the father of Universal, up until the 70s.
Yeah, in 1957, Putnam went to L.A. and started United Recording, and Bernie Clapper, who was his partner, took it over, and then Murray started. It was about 1970 started acquiring Universal, and by 1975 he had acquired the whole thing. So when I started, Murray was there. Bruce Swedin left somewhere in the mid-70s, went and got hired to do the musical The Wiz.
You know, he was actually a fan of that Harrison board.
Oh, yeah?
We had one at Warner Brothers Studios, and I remember that they said they had one over in his studio or something like that. It had a pretty gooey EQ, but it was also kind of
There
brittle.
were good Harrisons and there were cheap Harrisons.
Yeah, I loved the old video that you have online where it shows a couple of your techs giving a tour. They seem like such nice people in the front office.
We had a brilliant technical crew. We had about 6 or 8 techs at the peak of it, and the head of the technical department, his name was Tom Miller, which is really kind of ironic. And it's really funny because Tom Miller and I knew each other in high school. We played in band together. He was a trombonist and I played tuba, so I knew him. And Murray came to me one day. This had to be in the 1980s. He said, I just hired a guy named Tom Miller. And Tom Miller was an absolutely brilliant technician, and he would design equipment to make stuff work. Just a frighteningly smart guy.
Yeah, it seemed like if they opened up one of the panels, it's like they had this small console that had like 60 knobs, pots on it or whatever, and they opened it up, and it was like using chips, and it was just like a huge mixer of just knobs and things.
Yeah, I mean, you had to be able to work on analog gear, digital gear, consoles, film dubbers. I mean, they did it all.
Yeah, the early stuff, locking to film. Once you started getting from film to video, the whole idea of like making things sync up was such a pain in the butt too.
Right.
I mean, you had to have resolve to how sync and stuff like that. And boy, was it nice to have a tech around that understood that stuff.
Yeah. Like I said, we had the first synchronizer to lock up 224 tracks, so we had 48 track. And shortly after, the jingle industry kind of adopted the 3/4 inch pneumatic cassette as the video standard for doing commercials and stuff like that. So we had to be able to lock up the 3/4 inch machine also to our 24 track. And typically we would also have a 4 track that we could mix to that would also be locked up. So synchronization really became an important part of it.
Yeah. On the NECAM automation, real quick, to backtrack, was that still needed a track on the tape machine?
No, NECAM was the first one that was asynchronous. It actually recorded on those old floppies. The MCIs all had tape-based automation.
You had to take up 2 tracks to do it.
And the problem with those is that by about the 4th or 5th pass, analog tape is not really made to record modulated square waves, and you would start getting dropouts and stuff, and suddenly a fader would jump or something. It was not a really good system. But the NECAM was asynchronous and actually stored on floppy disk. It was a really slick system.
Yeah, that's a step in the right direction.
And it was also audio transparent because it wasn't VCAs.
And it's the predecessor to flying faders.
Yes.
Which was finally when they could start showing the moves that you made.
Yep.
So yeah, again, some brilliant engineering. Well, you mentioned like a big session with Ramsey Lewis. Talk a little bit about some of the sessions that went down while you were there.
Probably the high point of my Universal career was the Blues Brothers.
Wow.
Steve Cropper, Duck Dunn, Matt Guitar Murphy. I mean, it was insane. I got to work with Cab Calloway. I got to work with Ray Charles. Got to work with Aretha Franklin. Obviously, Belushi and Aykroyd. But Steve Cropper, I mean, and Duck Dunn, hearing those guys play was just
Steve Cropper.
insane.
I mean, the stuff on sitting on the dock of the bay that he plays, it's like this little noodling that's so beautiful.
Yep.
Yeah, what a
Steve
player.
Cropper always cracked me up. His rider was he had to have a small refrigerator next to his amp with long neck Budweisers. That was what he wanted. And you couldn't buy those in the store in those days. So Morris Lyda, who's the road manager, would go around to the bars and buy long neck Budweisers for
Is
Steve
that where
Croppers.
you picked up your fondness for beer?
No, I had that long ago.
Yeah, I mean, those kind of cats, it sort of made every sacrifice you ever made to do this worth it, to meet people like that and see music like that get made. Did Belushi and Aykroyd do their vocals there?
Yes, they did. We did everything there.
Oh, wow.
Belushi did not like being in the studio. He really did not enjoy that. He liked to be on camera, but he did not like being in the studio. So he did his vocals on an SM57 in the studio with the lights off.
Crazy, environment.
It was nuts.
With that production crew. I knew a couple people that used to bring supplies for that whole ensemble, and they were, it's one of the coolest things that was ever done in Chicago. I mean, you got the scene under Lakeshore Drive, out in Lake Zurich, crashing the cars with all the, I think John Candy's from Chicago. I think Belushi, I don't know if he was from Chicago. I don't know if he originally was, but. I worked with a commercial producer, Terry Fryer, who I think wrote or played B3.
Yeah, they brought in Terry. They needed an organ part, and they brought in Terry to put the Hammond part on.
Yeah, he's one of those guys with 11 fingers. Could play anything.
Oh, yeah, Terry Fryer was a monstrous player.
Yeah. So, lots of great records and then a lot of commercials too, right?
Oh, yeah. The 80s was commercial city. I started out doing Chicago R&B records. With a producer, Leo Graham and James Mack. They did Tyrone Davis. They did the Manhattans. I got my gold record for a group called the Manhattans. But it was so neat because they had a core rhythm section. Morris Jennings, P-Funk, Brian Gregory. They had a core rhythm section, so it didn't matter who the band was. The rhythm set players were always the same. So they would come in. The only thing that would change would be the artists would come in, the singers would come in and put their parts over it. And Leo and James wrote the tunes, and they brought in the group and stuff, and then they would bring in the artist, to sing the vocals and stuff. So it was a wonderful experience. But by about 84, the jingle industry in Chicago was insane. I was doing 70, 80 hours a week of jingles. It was wonderful work. I mean, it wasn't overly creative, but you got really fast, and you got, you talk about people spending a day to get a snare drum sound. That session walked out at 11:58, and at 12 o'clock, I have to have a drum sound ready to go.
Right.
Don't. If you got
It's
an hour
very
to get
good
a drum
training.
sound, yeah, I got 2 minutes.
Yeah.
So, but it was just by about 1985, I billed $500,000 of jingle money.
Wow.
It was crazy. Back in those days, people don't realize this. Our book rate for jingles in 1985 was $300 an hour. If you wanted 48 track, that was another $60
Everything was
an
extra.
hour. If you wanted video lockup, that was another $60 an hour. If you wanted Synchronization, that was another $60 an hour. So it was a huge business at the time. You couldn't watch TV in 1985 for a half hour and not see two jingles that I had done. I was doing a lot of McDonald's. I was doing all the Kroger. I was doing all the Kraft singles. I did Wendy's, Where's the Beef, that kind of stuff. I mean, it was just a huge industry at the time. And, that went till about 1990, till the bottom completely fell out.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, when I came to Chicago in the mid '90s, it was still going a little bit. And when I was working at CRC, which was one of the premier commercial things, studios during the day, and then be a music studio at night, which is like what you're talking about. You have the two shifts,
Right?
So I ended up being there around the clock. Okay, so at the Blues Brothers and Ramsey Lewis, and then all these great engineers. But the equipment, there must have been from Universal a host of 1176s and LA2As and
if you look at the video, in the little production room are 4 1176s.
Yeah.
We had about 5 Pultecs, and everything was in these little boxes, so you could carry it into any studio. 5 Pultecs, half a dozen 1176s in boxes. We had 3 LA2As. We had the first Eventides. We had some of the first. When I started, Universal had the first digital delay line in existence, the Lexicon Delta T. It had 128 milliseconds of delay, but it had 2 sides. So if you patched from one into the other, you could get 256 milliseconds of delay. And we would use that and send it into the live chamber. Universal had, at that time, 2 gorgeous live chambers. They're really interesting. It was just a non-parallel room. And we painted the walls with epoxy, and it had 2 speakers in it and a couple of mics, and we had some glass panels that you could move around to kind of diffuse it, but it was a wonderful sound.
Yeah, people don't realize some of these live echo chambers or reverberation chambers don't have to be that big. It's the shape.
In addition, we also had 8 EMT plates, and they were down in the sub-basement near Louis' restaurant, and we'd go down, and the engineer would say, well, go down and change the reverb time on this one. And you'd go down there, and we always threw a brick in first to make sure the rats would all scatter before we got in there. And ultimately, we did one of those things where we put a motor on it so you could control the RT60 from the control room.
Which changed the contacts to the foil, right, or something?
It was a plate. It was a huge plate. Basically, so it had a plate, and it had an asbestos panel. And the asbestos panel, the closer it was to the plate, your RT60 would come down. And if you backed it up, the RT60 would go up. So it was like dampening. Wow. But it was asbestos.
Yeah, the sound of a real chamber is incredible. To this day, I think you can rent out the chambers at Capitol. You can ISDN and rent out their chambers.
Oh, yeah?
The Sinatra and Beatles chambers. They're under the parking lot. They preserved them. All right, well, that's some of the gear. What about the microphones? I mean, it must have been...
Oh, Universal had 7 Neumann U47s, 6 Neumann U67s, 8 RCA DX77s.
Oh, the ribbons.
A couple of 44s.
The Elvis mic.
We had 10 Neumann U8 KM84s, some 83s. Neumann M49. I mean, it was a gorgeous mic setup. Murray loved mics, and he bought mics all the time. He would tend to be on the cutting edge. But, be able to do a session entirely with Neumann U47s, it was just insane.
Yeah, I was lucky to do a session at Abbey Road, and I was in the Beatle room doing something, and I went into the mic locker, and there was like rows of 47s and 67s, and I ended up getting U47 with serial number 0012 and 0013, like sequential 47s, which, I'm guessing were probably on the Beatles recordings, Wow, it's like they had a pretty amazing collection. Well, okay, so, all good things must pass. How did it sort of wind down? And
It didn't wind down. So I said in 1989, Murray had some issues with his taxes. He needed an investor. And so he brought an investor in who bought, and the investor unfortunately said, I will not invest unless you give me 51% of the company. So he now had controlling interest. So there was a rumor that the Walton building was going to be condemned. That's not true. So we moved Universal down to 32 West Randolph, which was actually the Oriental Theater building. Because the investor owned it. So we moved it down there, and we got out of Walton, and Walton ultimately became an Urban Outfitter. That actual building is now an Urban Outfitter. It's still there.
Right, yeah, I know
Yeah.
it is, yeah.
So we moved down to Randolph, and the problem was it was not a good room, and it was poorly mismanaged.
A lot to live up to.
Yeah, and Murray walked out on it ultimately, and within a year or two, it was bankrupt. So I moved to Streeterville at that time.
Yeah,
I had two record projects going on and a whole slew of jingle stuff going on. So I talked to Jimmy Dolan and said, I'd like to come over there. He had, at that time, 2 Neve VR rooms with flying faders.
Yeah.
So it worked perfect.
And one
he had a
SSL, too. He had another
he had a SSL back in the mix suite.
little mix room, yeah.
No, it was not really very good.
Yeah.
But he had
cool,
just
though.
bought a Synclavier, and he needed a Synclavier driver, so it worked out perfectly for me. I moved without started doing sessions the next day, and just happened to have an incredible year. Like I said, I had 2 record projects going on and a whole bunch of jingle clients. So,
well, yeah, I mean, your resume coming from Universal, that's pretty top notch. Before we touch a little more on Streeterville, I mean, like they must have been hard to move all that stuff out. Like, what did they do with that piano that was built around?
They opened up the entire glass in the front of Universal and put a crane on Walton and craned the piano and the Neve console out. And then we got down to 32S Randolph, and the Neve console would not fit in the elevator. So they had to take the elevator down, and we put the console on top of the freight elevator, and 6 of us stood on top of the freight elevator holding this Neve console as we went up. It was insane. It was clearly not decode. I mean,
And how sad to even have to do that.
Yeah.
But that's the board that ended up at the Village, right?
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, but when they went bankrupt, the Village bought that one and moved it out there.
And so many hit records done there. So many. Well, Streeterville,
It's still there. It's still being used.
Yeah, that's a beautiful facility. So Streeterville was kind of more like wooden sort of room with like the old wood stuff, and a lot of blues records were done there. I worked on an Albert King and Coco Taylor there and a few other things. What were some of the records you did over there?
They were by that point I was doing independent stuff because people would come in and they want Synclavier programming and stuff like that.
You never know.
Worked with a band called Nazaza. That was a really neat thing. But by that point I was doing more jingles than I was records.
Sure.
The records I were doing, and I was Marshall Jefferson, who kind of was one of the fathers of house music. I was his engineer for years, so I did a record. A couple of records with him. I did a 10 City record. I did a record with Vicki Ryan. And Marshall liked the fact that I could get Synclavier programming too. That was.
And then
But
it ends up on vinyl.
Streeterville had three music rooms at that time. Studio A, which was the bigger room, which you could put a big band in. Studio B, which was a little smaller, and that's where Bruce was doing most of the Alligator record stuff. And then they had this SSL mix suite, which was I refused to work there.
Sure. Yeah, no, Bruce Iglauer from Alligator, that's how I was working on all those blues records. It was really great with Coco Taylor, all these really, really great Chicago blues artists. So around after the Streeterville era, that's sort of when, I mean, had begun your teaching career then.
Yeah, started teaching in 1990. Murray asked me to teach a class, and it went well. And in 91, they asked me to teach the microphones class and the sync class. Next year, I added the signal processing class. So by 1996, I was teaching all 6 classes in the major as an adjunct. And I decided that I really wanted to transition to being a professor, and I got offered a job at Middle Tennessee State. I sent them my resume, and they sent me a thing that said, "We want to hire you." I said, "You mean you want an interview?" They said, "No, we want to hire you. With your background, we want you to come down here." So I went into the dean at DePaul and said, "Here's the deal. I've been offered this job." I said, "I'm going to give you an opportunity to create a full-time position. If you do, I understand, I'll have to apply and you'll have, candidates. But if you don't," I said, "I'm leaving." And they thought about it, and they decided at that point that they needed to commit to this program and put a full-time person in charge of it. So they created a position. I applied and everything, and ultimately got the job. And so, 97, I kind of quit the jingle industry and went to being a full-time professor. Oh. It's not only was a great opportunity for me, and I love teaching and I love working with kids. I've done 12 big band records at DePaul. 8 of them live at the Jazz Showcase. We would get Tim Powell's Metro Mobile truck parked out in the back, and we do these live big band records at the Jazz Showcase. It was so much fun. Tom Harrell, Slide Hampton, Jeff Hamilton. I mean, Phil Woods. We did 3 records with Phil Woods, and so that was a great opportunity. I did probably 10 or 12 records, classical records with the Wind Ensemble with Don DeRoche for Albany Records. So it was a great opportunity. I got to do, still got to do enough recording, but I wasn't, hustling for jingle gigs. Yeah, I was going to point out before when we were talking about commercials, is that part of the joy of that was these were top-notch musicians. Oh. They came in and could read a chart without never having to hear anything. And they had to nail it in the first take, and they had their tones together. Everything was good to go. It was bada boom, bada bing, and you're in and out. And same with these big band records. I mean, you're talking about, 5 or 6, maybe at least 5 or 6 horns and up. Yeah, no, we had, our standard was 5 trumpets, 4 trombones, 3 trombones and bass bone, 5 saxes, piano, bass, drums, guitar. And sometimes we had vibes, and sometimes we had percussion, and occasionally there'd be a vocalist or something. So this was a full, it was 34 mics. Yeah, it's and what that's when those musicians could really make a good living, which has been very difficult these days. That whole real musician thing has been very decimated. But you're right about the jingle players. The jingle players were monsters. I mean, these guys would do jingles all day, and they would come in and put the chart in front of them. And they'd kind of run it down one time and then go. Yeah, if anybody, should watch the Wrecking Crew video, too, about the L.A. version of, they were jingle musicians in the day, and then at night they tracked all the records, like the Beach Boys and all the great themes. It's an amazing documentary about, that sort of same... Yeah, Chicago had musicians of that quality, just lots of them. Yeah, we're going to do more about the history of Chicago recording than I had anticipated, because... Even before all that, there was Chess Records and all that crazy stuff with the blues. So, in the 1950s, Chicago was the premier recording place. That's why the Stones came here. Yeah. They wanted to get that Chicago sound. Right. And VJ and Chess Records, they were, and Universal had their own record label at the time. It was the premier place to record. Bill Putnam did... just the number of people that he worked with is frightening. Duke Ellington said Putnam was his favorite recorder. Frank Sinatra would cancel dates if Bill Putnam was not available. I mean, he was the cat. So, we touched a little bit on making a living as a recording engineer is very difficult, especially these days with studios are less and less and technology is cheaper. And, there are certain things that, you can still find a way to make a good living. I love your story because
you're able to give back to the teaching and the students, all that, and yet still you can make records and have a lot of fun being creative. And I know you do a lot of amazing original stuff with the animated, what do you call it? Electroacoustic.
Intermedia inventions is what I call them. They're little 3-minute multimedia pieces, and they're usually mixed in surround, and they're kind of trippy. I really enjoy doing that. I also write silent film scores, and next year we are doing a world premiere of an entire film score to the movie Metropolis. 2 hours of Metropolis for 30 musicians, 12 brass, 10 woodwinds, 8 percussionists, and theremin.
Wow.
And it's going to be done
Like
live
behind you
with
is a little
picture.
kit theremin. That
Uh-huh.
thing. I'm going to do a little series on the theremin too.
So I will be doing the theremin part live, and it's going to premiere it next March. Put the plug in.
Good Vibrations, man. Actually, I was reading the Good Vibrations theremin part. It actually was something.
It's a Therminovox. It was not a theremin.
It wasn't a theremin. It was like
Yeah.
a ribbon or something.
It's the same kind of heterodyning technology, but instead of doing it with hand gestures, it actually had I'm not sure if that one had a keyboard or just had the ring. It was more similar to an Owens Martineau than it was really a theremin.
Because they do the key change. They pitch is very good, and they did the key change in there too.
Yeah, no, that was not an actual theremin.
Yeah, theremin's tricky to play, but what a cool sound. As I was getting to, it's a difficult job to make a living at. Any advice for learning and earning a living in this crazy?
Yes, you need to be a jack of all trades. I teach video editing, and students come to me and say, well, why should I learn that? Because the more you know about all the different areas of this industry, the more powerful you are. I had a student graduated, Jeremy Bircher, and he's working for a production company, started out doing video editing for this production company, and then got into music, and 3 years ago, they wrote the Coke, Taste the Feeling jingle. So he's worked in different parts of the industry. So the more things you can do, the more valuable. So students ask, why should I study electronics? The more you know about that, the more valuable you're going to be to somebody. So don't say I'm only going to do this.
Yeah, it's very important these days. That's why I keep harping on the fundamentals, because the more solid you are in the fundamentals, the more you can have a sort of a confidence in the theory that's behind all the art. There's, science and art. It's the combination of science and art. And to know the science and then have that be, fundamental knowledge allows you to free up your creative mind.
It's the first thing I tell students. If you're worried about where the audio's going, or what buses you need to use and stuff, you're not listening to the music. That should be just automatic. You should not have to think about that. And that's why I stand there and scream at them. In a tracking mode, what's the input of the channel side? What's the input of the monitor side? That stuff needs to be automatic. When we switch to mix mode, what's the input of the channel side? What's the input of the monitor side? That needs to be automatic. You can't be thinking about that.
Yeah, and as much for yourself, but for the artist, I mean, you don't want that to be noticeable at all.
No,
you don't
that
want to
should be
interfere at
completely
all.
invisible.
The
Yep.
more invisible, the better, and then you make it look easy, and it's not easy. I mean, it's not. I guess
It's not rocket science.
it's some of the similar concepts, though. What's sort of your secret to a happy life?
Like what you do. If you like what you do, my life. I write music. I record music. There's really I'm blessed to have a job that allows me to do that. So there's really no difference between what I do for my job and what I do for fun. So it's not really a job. I enjoy teaching. I'm teaching a film scoring class right now. Last Thursday, I did a class on the new Dune movie. So I was watching the movie, and my wife said, "What are you doing?" I said, "I'm studying for my class. I'm watching Dune." So it's a wonderful job. I love my job. I'm working with youth. I'm getting the next generation of engineers ready. We've done really well. I've got students in all different areas. I got a student that has a studio in town here. I got a student that works at Rax Tracks. I got a student that works on Call of Duty, doing video game design. I've got a young lady has her own company in LA doing kids cartoons, Dora the Explorer and stuff.
Oh, wow.
I have a young lady who's in charge of audio for Mattel Toys. She's got like 10 people working for her. They design the chips, they make the sounds, they write the little tunes for the cars. She actually hired one of our students to come out there. So there's a lot of opportunities out there in different areas as long as you're open to that,
It's such an honor to have helped somebody find their path a little bit too. I have a couple interns, or one that won a Grammy, others that are out there working with Kanye and doing real well. So
Sorry to hear that.
Yeah, well, that's just the name that came out. He works with a lot of other great artists too. That's funny. I've got some stories about that too. Okay, well. That's a lot of information. Thanks so much. I think that there's so much that people can learn from you and are learning from you. And, I would guess, you'd probably be doing this for a long, long time, in terms of like being a professor. That's quite an achievement.
I've had a wonderful life, being a full-time recording engineer in the heydays of Universal, and then being a college professor teaching kids recordings. I've been very blessed.
Yeah, very cool, man. Thanks for doing this. All right.
My pleasure.
We'll see you around.